Welcome back, everyone. If you are enjoying this lesson, please like, share, and subscribe to this channel and share it with friends for this free course on Decode Healthcare with Arshil. All right, let's jump right into today's masterclass. We're breaking down the anatomy of a claim, demystifying exactly how clinical documentation specificity drives inpatient hospital reimbursement through the MSDRG system. We're going to see firsthand how a physician's exact words translate into codes and ultimately into the financial lifeblood of a healthcare facility. Here's our roadmap for this lesson. We're covering what is a DRG, the MSDRG architecture, the power of CCs and MCCs, present on admission impacts, clinical documentation integrity, and we'll wrap up with some best practices. All right, Section 1. What exactly is a DRG? Let's quickly establish our foundational concepts here. So, the golden rule to remember here is that a DRG basically boils down to clinical similarity plus resource similarity. Put those together and you get one uniform payment group for Medicare and commercial payers. You probably know it started at Yale and evolved into the MSDRG system CMS uses today. But fundamentally, this system is the ultimate equalizer, right? It takes thousands of crazy complex clinical scenarios and groups them into manageable categories based on the resources we realistically expect a patient to consume. But how do we actually land on that single specific DRG? Well, medical coders are the absolute linchpin here. They're pulling very specific inputs straight from the chart. They're looking for the principal diagnosis, the main reason for the admission, along with secondary diagnoses to capture those crucial comorbidities and complications. Throw in procedures, patient demographics like age and discharge status, and boom! These inputs all run together to generate the MSDRG code, the expected length of stay, and at the end of the day, the hospital's payment amount. Moving on to Section 2, the MSDRG architecture. Let's take a look under the hood at the grouper logic.
You can think of the MSDRG system as this massive logic engine, taking thousands of variables and funneling them down into roughly 750 payment categories. It's a pretty straightforward step through. First, you identify the principal diagnosis to establish the base family. Then, you check those secondary diagnoses for severity. Step 3, identify major procedures, because that might bump your patient over from a medical DRG to a surgical one. Finally, adjust for demographics, and the system spits out the assigned MSDRG.
This flow makes the architecture really easy to visualize. Starting from one of the 25 major diagnostic categories, say MDC 05 for the circulatory system, we immediately hit a fork in the road. We split into either medical or surgical partitions based on whether a major OR procedure happened. And from there, we drop right into a highly critical three-tier structure based entirely on severity.
Which brings us to Section 3, the power of CCs and MCCs. We absolutely need to zoom in on these severity adjustments because, honestly, this is where the financial and compliance stakes get incredibly high. So, secondary diagnoses get mapped to act as either complications or major complications, and it literally just takes one. Having a single MCC, think sepsis or maybe acute renal failure, rockets the patient right into the highest payment tier. A standard CC, like malnutrition or a simple UTI, drops them in that middle tier, and obviously having neither leaves them at the baseline. This logic is what drives the relative weight of the DRG, which acts as the multiplier for the hospital's base payment rate. It's a huge deal.
Let's look at a hero and villain case study. Vague documentation versus highly specific documentation. In our vague scenario, a patient comes in with shortness of breath, and it's documented simply as pneumonia with uncomplicated type 2 diabetes. That lands us in MSDRG 195 without any CC or MCC. But let's look at the exact same patient with specific documentation. The physician notes the patient is actually acutely septic and in diabetic ketoacidosis. Now the principal diagnosis shifts correctly to sepsis. The DKA hits as a major complication, and suddenly we're in MSDRG 871. By capturing that specific scenario, the relative weight skyrockets to 1.9015. That is more than double the weight of the vague chart. To put that in perspective, this single number proves exactly how precise documentation directly protects your rightful revenue. It accurately captures the intense, real-world resources required to treat sepsis and DKA compared to just run-of-the-mill pneumonia.
Now for Section 4, the present on admission or POA impact. Because guys, it's not just about what conditions a patient actually has, it is heavily dependent on when they got them.
Let's say your patient develops an acute deep vein thrombosis, or DVT, after they're admitted. Normally, a DVT is an MCC,
But because it gets flagged with an N for not present on admission, it instantly becomes a hospital-acquired condition, or HAC. And under Medicare rules, that HAC is completely nullified from increasing the DRG payment, zero bump. The hospital still gets paid for what was present on admission, sure, but now they're facing quality reviews and essentially eating the cost for the complication that happened under their own roof.
All right, Section 5, Clinical Documentation Integrity. To avoid those exact revenue losses and make sure we have absolute accuracy from day one, hospitals lean heavily on their CDI teams.
Which brings up a really common question. What exactly triggers a coder or a CDI specialist to formally query a physician? Because, let's be real, they can't just guess what the doctor meant. They need explicit words on the page.
Basically, you query whenever there's a gap. If a chart just says history of stroke, instead of detailing the specific cerebral infarction, you query. Or if severity is totally missing, like writing just CHF instead of acute on chronic systolic CHF. That's a massive missed opportunity for a CC or MCC driver. You also have to query if the physician forgets to link a cause and effect, or honestly just misses basic laterality, like forgetting to specify if a condition was on the left or right side.
And we have to walk a really fine line here. CDI is entirely about finding the clinical truth, not just artificially inflating the bill. Upcoding, which is assigning a higher severity code than the documentation actually supports, is a massive compliance risk. It practically invites audits and fraud penalties. But on the flip side, undercoding unjustly robs the facility of compensation for the complex, intense care they actually provided. So the goal is always ethical optimization, making sure the codes perfectly mirror the severity of care delivered. No more, no less.
Finally, Section 6, Best Practices for Coders. Let's talk about how we can proactively build query-proof records right from the jump.
To do this, coders have to track the patient's entire clinical journey across all these different reports. You pull the history and physical for the principal diagnosis, you comb through the daily progress notes to track the severity of illness, and you check operative notes for the exact procedural techniques. But here's the kicker. The physician must explicitly correlate objective lab evidence, like, say, a spiking troponin level, with their written diagnoses in those progress notes. The dots have to be connected on paper.
So how do we make a chart truly query-proof? First, you maximize specificity. Organism, site, severity. Always explicitly link conditions using phrases like due to or manifested by. For example, diabetic foot ulcer with osteomyelitis. Always confirm laterality for all anatomical sites. Document the precise procedural approach. Was it open or percutaneous? And please, never leave an acute manifestation like acute organ dysfunction tied to sepsis undocumented.
When your documentation is pristine, that data tells the true, undeniable story of your hospital's quality and resource utilization. So think about the question we're posing here. How will mastering MSDRG architecture and ethical documentation transform your facility? Are you leaving rightful revenue on the table, or are your charts genuinely query-proof? That's all for today's masterclass. If you are enjoying this lesson, please like, share, and subscribe to this channel and share it with friends for this free course on Decode Healthcare with Harshal. See you next time.